I woke up at 5:30 that Tuesday morning to find a chain-link fence running straight through the middle of my grazing field, and I knew my life was about to become a special kind of hell. My name is Jacob Emmerson, and I've been raising cattle on my 40-acre property outside Kalispell, Montana, for the past 11 years. The sun was just starting to peek over the Flathead Valley when I walked outside with my coffee and saw that metal monstrosity gleaming in the early light, cutting my best pasture completely in half. My 90 head of cattle were clustered on the far side of the fence, milling around confused, unable to reach the water trough on this side. I stood there in my boots and jacket, steam rising from my mug, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The fence was professional grade, 8 feet tall with 3 strands of barbed wire on top, posts sunk deep into ground that had been my family's land for 3 generations. On the near side, closest to the road, someone had already started grading the earth flat and laying down gravel. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor, Bill Henderson, who lived on the adjacent property. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice thick with sleep. "Bill, you seeing this?" I asked. "Seeing what?" "The fence. Someone put up a fence through my grazing field." There was a pause. "What are you talking about?" "Get outside and look toward my property. There's an 8-foot chain-link fence right through the middle of my pasture." I heard rustling, then footsteps, then Bill cursed. "What in the hell? When did that happen?" "No idea. It wasn't here when I checked the cattle last night around 9. "So someone did this in the middle of the night?" "Looks that way." Bill was quiet for a moment. "You know what this is about, don't you?" I did. 3 months ago, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had somehow managed to incorporate a portion of rural properties into their jurisdiction through some legal maneuvering I still didn't fully understand. My property was technically on the edge of their development, but I'd always been considered outside their boundaries. Until the county rezoned the area, and suddenly I was getting letters about violations I'd never agreed to be subject to. "I'm calling the sheriff," I said. "Good luck with that. Sheriff Morrison's wife is on the HOA board." I hung up and dialed anyway. The dispatcher told me a deputy would be out sometime that morning. I looked back at my cattle. They were getting agitated now, calling out, searching for water. I couldn't just leave them like that. I grabbed my wire cutters from the barn and walked out to the fence. Before I could make the first cut, a white Mercedes SUV came tearing down my driveway, gravel spraying everywhere. Out stepped Donna Pritchard, the HOA president, wearing pressed khakis and a lavender polo shirt despite the early hour. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight enough to lift her eyebrows, and she had that pursed lip expression that told me she'd been waiting for this confrontation. "Mr. Emmerson, step away from that fence," she called out, her voice sharp as a blade. "This is my property, Donna. Actually, according to the county rezoning and the HOA covenant documentation you signed when you received your notification packet, this portion of land has been designated for community parking overflow." She pulled out a folder from her vehicle, waving it at me like a weapon. "The main Whispering Pines parking area is at capacity, and we need additional spaces for residents and visitors. I never signed anything agreeing to this. Your signature wasn't required. The majority of property owners in the newly incorporated area voted in favor of the parking expansion. That's how HOA governance works." I stared at her. "You're telling me that people who don't even live on my land voted to take a portion of it for parking?" "It's not taking, Mr. Emmerson. It's community allocation. And before you damage HOA property with those wire cutters, I should inform you that we have surveillance cameras monitoring the fence. Any vandalism will result in immediate legal action and fines of up to $500 per day, plus restoration costs." My jaw clenched so hard, I thought my teeth might crack. "My cattle need water. They can't get to the trough." "Then I suggest you relocate your trough to the appropriate side of the fence. The parking area construction begins today, and we need to maintain clear access." She glanced at her watch. "The paving crew will be here at 8. "You're paving my field?" "We're paving the designated community parking area, 40 spaces, plus handicap accessible spots and proper drainage. It's all in the site plan." She pulled another paper from her folder. "This was approved by the Architectural Review Committee 6 weeks ago. Nobody told me about any of this. 3 notices were mailed to your address. We have certified mail receipts." Her smile was thin and cold. Perhaps you should check your mailbox more regularly. I thought back to the official-looking envelopes I'd been tossing aside, assuming they were the usual HOA harassment about my barn needing paint or my grass being 2 inches too tall. I'd never imagined they'd actually try something like this. "This isn't legal," I said. "You can't just take someone's land." "We're not taking it. The land remains in your name. We're simply exercising the community access rights granted under the HOA covenant. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the Architectural Review Committee. They meet the 3rd Thursday of every month." She checked her watch again. "Now, I have to get back for a conference call. Please do not damage the fence, Mr. Emmerson. Have a pleasant day." She climbed back into her Mercedes and drove off, leaving me standing there with wire cutters in my hand and 90 head of cattle bawling behind that fence. I called my lawyer, Tom Rutherford, at 7 o'clock. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, then let out a long sigh. "Jacob, I warned you about ignoring those HOA notices. I didn't think they could actually do something like this. Montana law gives HOAs pretty broad authority when it comes to community improvements, especially in newly incorporated zones. If the rezoning went through and you didn't contest it during the public comment period, and if the majority of affected property owners voted in favor, then they probably do have the legal right to designate portions of land for community use. But it's my land. My cattle are on it. Doesn't that count for something? Agriculture gets complicated when it's mixed with residential zoning. What does your deed say?" "I don't know. It's the same deed my grandfather had." "That's the problem. Old agricultural deeds don't have the protections against HOA jurisdiction that newer ones might. When was the last time you had a survey done?" "Never. We've always known where our boundaries are." Tom was quiet for a moment. "I need to see all the paperwork. Bring me everything the HOA sent you, your deed, your property tax records, everything." "But Jacob, I'm going to be straight with you. This might be a legal situation even if it's not a fair one." "So what do I do about my cattle?" "Move the water trough. Get them on the right side of the fence. Don't give them any excuse to claim you're interfering with their construction project. And whatever you do, don't cut that fence. They'll nail you with property damage charges and it'll undermine any case we might build." I spent the next 3 hours moving my cattle around to the back 40 acres, hauling water in my truck because the fence had cut off access to the main line. The animals were stressed and confused, and several of the calves were bawling for their mothers. By the time I got everyone settled, the paving crew had arrived with 2 dump trucks full of gravel and a steamroller that looked like it could flatten a car. Deputy Jason Mills showed up around 10:30, stepping out of his cruiser with the slow, reluctant movements of a man who really didn't want to be there. He'd gone to high school with my younger brother, and I could see the apology in his eyes before he even spoke. "Jacob, I got your call about the fence. You can see the situation, Jason." He looked out at the construction crew, then back at me. "I talked to Donna Pritchard on my way over. She showed me the HOA documentation and the county rezoning approval. It looks like they have the permits for this. Permits to take my grazing land? Permits to construct community parking on designated HOA accessible property. Look, I know this is rough, but if the paperwork is in order, there's not much I can do from a law enforcement perspective. This is a civil matter." They did this overnight without warning me. The construction permits were filed 3 weeks ago. They're public record. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Did you get any notices from the HOA?" I didn't answer, which was answer enough. Jason nodded slowly. "You need to get a lawyer, Jacob. This isn't something I can fix with a badge. I'm sorry." He left, and I watched the construction crew start spreading gravel across what used to be some of the best grazing land in the valley. The grass was already dying under the weight of the trucks, and they'd marked out parking spaces with spray paint, 40 rectangles that buried 3 acres of my field under rocks and asphalt. That evening, I drove into town with all my paperwork in a box and met Tom at his office. He spent an hour going through everything while I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, watching the light fade outside his window. "Here's what I can tell you," Tom finally said. "The HOA sent you 3 certified letters. The first one, dated 3 months ago, notified you of the rezoning and your inclusion in the Whispering Pines HOA boundaries. The second one, dated 2 months ago, outlined proposed community improvements including parking expansion and asked for property owner input. The third one, dated 6 weeks ago, detailed the final parking plan and construction timeline. I never signed for any certified letters. You didn't have to. After 3 delivery attempts, the post office marks them as refused and they're considered legally delivered. The HOA has documentation of all 3 attempts. He pulled out another paper. This is your original deed from 1982. It doesn't have any HOA restrictions because HOAs barely existed in this area back then. But it also doesn't have any protections against future incorporation into one. So I'm just screwed. Not necessarily. The issue is whether the HOA had the right to designate your specific property for community parking without compensation. Montana law requires that HOA actions be reasonable and not impose undue hardship on individual property owners. Cutting off access to grazing land and water for 90 head of cattle could definitely qualify as undue hardship. So we can fight this? We can file for an injunction to halt construction while we argue the case. But Jacob, that's going to take time and money. We're talking months of legal proceedings, and there's no guarantee we win. The HOA has lawyers too, and they clearly did their homework before starting this project. What's it going to cost? Tom leaned back in his chair. An initial filing and injunction request, maybe $5,000. If it goes to a full hearing, we could be looking at $20,000 to $30,000, possibly more if they fight hard. I thought about my bank account, about the modest savings I'd built up from selling cattle each year. I thought about my 90 head out there, crowded onto land that wasn't sufficient to sustain them long term. Do it, I said. File for the injunction. Tom nodded. I'll get the paperwork started tonight, but in the meantime, you need to document everything. Take photos, keep records of every expense this causes you, every inconvenience. If we can show material harm, it strengthens our case. I drove home in the dark, and when I got there, the construction crew had left, but the damage was clear. My field was half gone, replaced by neat rows of gravel that looked like a scar across the land. The fence gleamed in my headlights, solid and immovable, a monument to bureaucracy and someone else's convenience. The next morning, Donna Pritchard was back, this time with 2 other women I recognized from HOA meetings I'd been forced to attend. One was Susan Whitmore, the Architectural Review Committee chair, a red-headed woman in her 50s who wore too much jewelry. The other was Patricia Montgomery, the HOA secretary, who kept detailed minutes of every meeting and seemed to take pleasure in recording violations. They stood at the fence line while I was feeding my cattle, and Donna waved me over with the imperious gesture of someone who expected to be obeyed. Mr. Emmerson, we need to discuss your cattle situation. I walked over slowly, taking my time. What about it? Several residents have complained about the noise and smell. The lowing at night is disturbing people trying to sleep, and there are concerns about property values with livestock so close to residential areas. My cattle have been here for 11 years. Your development is what's new. Susan Whitmore stepped forward, bracelets jangling. Be that as it may, the HOA covenant includes provisions about appropriate land use in residential zones. Agricultural activities that create noise pollution or odors are subject to review and potential restriction. You've got to be kidding me. We're not, Patricia said, pulling out her tablet. I have documentation of 12 complaints filed in the past week alone. Residents are concerned about flies, about the noise, about the impact on their home values. The Architectural Review Committee is going to meet next week to discuss potential livestock restrictions. Restrictions like what? Like prohibiting cattle in residential zones, Susan said flatly, or at minimum, requiring they be kept a certain distance from residential structures, say, 200 yards. I looked at my land. 200 yards from the nearest house would put my cattle in the ravine at the back of my property, where there was barely any grazing and no shelter from weather. You're trying to force me to get rid of my cattle. We're trying to maintain quality of life for all residents in the community, Donna said. Your agricultural activities are incompatible with the residential character of Whispering Pines. Then why did you incorporate my property into your HOA? Because it's within the designated zone boundaries. The county rezoning wasn't up to us. She pulled out another paper. "This is a notice of your monthly HOA dues. They're due by the first of each month, $250. I stared at the paper. "You want me to pay you $250 a month?" "It's what all residents pay. The fees cover community maintenance, landscaping, security patrols, and administrative costs." "I don't use any of those services." "That's irrelevant. All property owners within HOA boundaries are required to pay dues. Failure to pay will result in late fees of $50 per month, and continued non-payment can result in a lien on your property." They left me standing there with the paper in my hand, and I realized this was never about parking or community improvement. This was about forcing me out. The parking lot was just the first move in a campaign to make my life so difficult that I'd have no choice but to sell my land and leave. That afternoon, I got a call from Bill Henderson. His voice was tight with anger. "Jacob, you need to see this." "See what?" "Get over here, now." I drove the quarter-mile to his place and found him standing in his driveway holding a letter. His face was red, veins standing out on his neck. "They sent me a notice," he said. "The HOA is fining me $2,000 for having an unlicensed vehicle on my property." "What unlicensed vehicle?" He pointed to his barn. Inside was his father's 1967 Ford pickup, a project truck he'd been slowly restoring for the past 5 years. It hadn't run in a decade, but it was on his private property, inside a barn. They said any vehicle visible from the road or neighboring properties must be currently licensed and operational. Since this truck doesn't have current plates, it's a violation. $2,000 fine, and I have 30 days to remove it, or the fine doubles. "That truck is in your barn. They said the barn door was open last week and someone saw it during an HOA inspection sweep. They took photos." He showed me his phone. Sure enough, there were pictures of his barn interior, taken from his driveway. "They were on my property taking pictures without permission. That's trespassing. Try proving it. They'll say they were on the driveway, which they consider community access under some clause in the covenant." Bill crumpled the letter. "I've lived here 32 years, Jacob. 32 years, and now some HOA is telling me I can't keep my dad's truck in my own barn? Talk to Tom Rutherford. He's filing an injunction for me about the parking lot. Maybe he can help you too." "I can't afford a lawyer. You know how much I'm barely scraping by since Mary's medical bills." His wife had fought cancer for 2 years before passing away last spring, and the costs had nearly bankrupted him. "I'll have to sell the truck. It's worth maybe $800 for scrap. But that fine, those dues they're demanding, I can't pay that and keep the ranch." I looked at my neighbor, my friend, and saw the defeat in his eyes. This was their strategy. They couldn't just force people out directly, so they'd bury us in fines and fees and restrictions until we had no choice but to leave. "Don't pay the fine yet," I said. "Let me talk to Tom. We'll figure something out." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure how. Tom's estimate of $20,000 to $30,000 for legal fees was already more than I wanted to spend. Adding Bill's case would only increase the costs, and I knew there were probably other longtime residents getting hit with similar notices. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandfather, who'd bought this land in 1952 with money saved from working in the copper mines. He'd built the house and barn with his own hands, raised cattle, built a life. My father had done the same, and when he'd passed away 8 years ago, I'd promised to keep the ranch going. Now, some HOA president in pressed khakis was going to take it all away because she wanted parking for her development. At 2 in the morning, I got up and did something I'd been avoiding. I went through every piece of mail the HOA had sent me, reading everything carefully. The certified letters Tom mentioned were documented as delivery attempts 3 times each. The first had come when I was in Helena for a cattle auction. The second had come during a week when I'd been dealing with a sick cow and hadn't bothered with mail. The third, I genuinely didn't remember, but according to the postal records, I'd refused to sign. The notices detailed everything: the rezoning, the parking plan, the architectural guidelines, the livestock restrictions, everything. If I had read them when they arrived, if I had taken them seriously, maybe I could have fought this earlier. Maybe I could have attended the county meetings, filed objections, organized other property owners. But I hadn't, and now I was paying the price. The injunction hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Tom filed the paperwork and got a temporary restraining order that halted further construction on the parking lot, but it didn't remove what was already there. The fence stayed up, the gravel stayed down, and my cattle stayed crowded on the back 40 acres. The day after the restraining order was filed, I got a visit from a county inspector. He was a thin man in his 40s named Greg Sullivan, and he carried a clipboard and a camera. "Mr. Emmerson, I'm here to conduct a livestock welfare inspection." "Based on what?" "Anonymous complaints filed with the county. I'm required to investigate any allegations of inadequate care or overcrowding." I knew exactly who had filed the complaints, but there was nothing I could do about it. I showed Greg around the property, let him count the cattle, check the water supply, examine the feed situation. He took notes, took pictures, and didn't say much. When he was done, he handed me a form. "You've got 90 head on approximately 15 usable acres, given the fence situation. That's 6 cattle per acre, which is over the recommended density for this type of land. The county recommendation is 2 to 3 acres per cow-calf pair in this climate. I have 40 acres total, but the cattle can't access half of it due to the fence. Based on current conditions, you're technically overcrowded. That's because the HOA fenced off my grazing land. I understand there's a legal dispute about that, but my job is to assess current conditions, not assign blame." He checked something on his clipboard. "I'm not going to cite you right now, but I'm putting you on a watch list. If conditions don't improve in the next 30 days, you'll need to reduce your herd size to meet county guidelines." "Reduce it to what?" "Based on the available grazing area, I'd say no more than 40 head, maybe 50 if you can demonstrate adequate supplemental feeding." "You're telling me I have to get rid of half my cattle?" "I'm telling you that current conditions don't meet county standards for livestock welfare. How you address that is up to you, but it needs to be addressed." He handed me a copy of his report. "You'll get an official notice in the mail within 5 business days. If you want to appeal, there's a process outlined in the documentation." After he left, I sat on my porch steps and did the math. 90 head of cattle represented years of careful breeding and herd building. Each cow was worth roughly $1,500, the calves around $800. If I had to sell half my herd, I'd be losing close to $60,000 in livestock value, not to mention the future income from breeding and sales. And even if I won the legal battle eventually, getting my herd back to full size would take years. I called Tom and told him about the inspection. "They're tightening the noose," he said. "Force you into overcrowding by taking your land, then cite you for overcrowding to force you to reduce the herd. It's smart, in a ruthless sort of way." "Can they do this?" "The county has legitimate authority to enforce livestock welfare standards. If the inspector says you're overcrowded, then legally you are, regardless of why. We can argue that the HOA's actions created the situation, but that doesn't change the immediate reality." "So what do I do?" "You have a few options. 1, you could lease additional grazing land from a neighbor to spread out the herd temporarily. 2, you could sell some cattle and take the financial hit. 3, you could try to move them all to another property, but that's expensive and complicated. I don't have another property, and I can't afford to lease land on top of legal fees. Then you might need to consider selling some of the herd. I know that's not what you want to hear, but we need to keep you in compliance with county regulations. If they cite you for livestock violations, it'll hurt our case at the injunction hearing." I spent that evening calling everyone I knew who might have spare grazing land. Most were already at capacity with their own herds, and the few who had space wanted rental fees I couldn't afford. By midnight, I'd accepted the inevitable. I was going to have to sell cattle. The auction was on Friday. I brought 35 head, mostly yearlings and cows that were getting older. They sold for decent prices, but watching them load into trucks bound for other ranches felt like cutting off pieces of my family legacy. These were descendants of cattle my grandfather had raised, animals I'd known since birth. The auctioneer handed me a check for $42,000. It should have felt like a windfall, but all I felt was hollow. With the herd reduced to 55 head, the county inspector came back and grudgingly approved the situation as marginally acceptable. The notice of violation was withdrawn, but I knew it was temporary. As long as that fence stood, I was vulnerable. The HOA sent me another notice 3 days before the injunction hearing. This one informed me that my barn was in violation of architectural guidelines because it hadn't been painted in over 10 years, and the faded red color was not consistent with the aesthetic standards of Whispering Pines. I had 60 days to repaint it in an approved color, which according to the attached color chart meant beige, gray, or tan. My barn had been red for 73 years. I crumpled the notice and threw it away. The injunction hearing was held in the Flathead County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning. Tom and I sat at one table, while Donna Pritchard sat at another, with a lawyer named Richard Blackwell, a sharp-dressed man from Missoula with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Judge Catherine Morrison presided. She was in her 60s, a no-nonsense woman who'd been on the bench for 20 years. I'd heard she was fair, but strict about proper procedure. Tom presented our case first. He explained the situation, showed photos of the fence and parking lot, documented the impact on my cattle operation. He argued that the HOA had acted unreasonably in designating critical grazing land for parking without considering the impact on my agricultural activities, and that their actions had caused material harm to my business. The defendant, Mr. Emmerson, has operated a cattle ranch on this property for over a decade, Tom said. His family has owned this land for 70 years. The sudden incorporation into an HOA and the immediate appropriation of 3 acres of grazing land for parking has forced him to sell nearly 40% of his herd, resulting in significant financial loss. This is exactly the kind of undue hardship that HOA regulations are meant to prevent. Richard Blackwell stood up for his response. He was smooth and confident, speaking like he'd made this argument 100 times before. Your Honor, the Whispering Pines. HOA followed all proper procedures in this matter. The county rezoning was conducted with full public notice and comment periods. Mr. Emmerson had multiple opportunities to attend county meetings and raise objections. He did not. The HOA sent 3 certified letters notifying him of the rezoning, the proposed parking expansion, and the final construction plans. He refused delivery on all 3. The HOA held community meetings to discuss the parking project. Mr. Emmerson did not attend. At every step of this process, he had the opportunity to participate in the decision-making and chose not to. He pulled out a thick folder. Furthermore, the parking expansion was approved by a vote of property owners within the affected zone. 67% voted in favor. This was a democratic process, and Mr. Emmerson is now attempting to use the courts to overturn the will of the majority because he doesn't like the outcome. Judge Morrison looked at me. Mr. Emmerson, is it true you didn't attend any county meetings about the rezoning? I stood up. Tom tried to pull me back down, but I shook my head. Your Honor, I didn't attend because I didn't think the rezoning applied to me. My property has been agricultural land since 1952. I never imagined the county would incorporate it into a residential HOA. But you received notices about it? I received mail from the HOA. I thought it was more harassment about minor violations. They'd been sending me notices for months about things like my grass being too long or my truck being parked in the wrong spot. I didn't realize they were going to actually take my land. Did you read the notices? I hesitated. No, Your Honor, not until after the fence went up. She made a note. Mr. Rutherford, continue. Tom stood back up. Your Honor, even if Mr. Emmerson didn't participate in the initial process, that doesn't give the HOA carte blanche to cause material harm to his business. Montana law requires that HOA actions be reasonable and not impose undue hardship. Taking 3 acres of grazing land without compensation and forcing the sale of 35 head of cattle clearly qualifies as undue hardship. The HOA didn't take the land, Blackwell countered. Mr. Emmerson still owns it. He still pays taxes on it. The HOA simply exercised community access rights granted under the covenant, and the parking lot serves a legitimate community need. The main parking area for Whispering Pines is consistently at capacity, especially on weekends and during community events. The expanded parking was necessary. Necessary at the expense of destroying someone's livelihood? Tom shot back. Necessary to serve the needs of 342 families who live in Whispering Pines, Blackwell said. The needs of the many outweigh the inconvenience of the one. Judge Morrison held up her hand. Gentlemen, Let's keep this civil." She looked through the paperwork for several minutes, then looked up. "Here's my problem with this case. Mr. Emmerson, you had multiple opportunities to engage with this process before it reached this point. You chose not to. You didn't attend meetings, you didn't read notices, you didn't participate in the democratic process that led to this decision. Now, you want the court to step in and fix a problem that could have been prevented if you'd simply paid attention." "Your Honor, I didn't think." "You didn't think, and that's exactly the issue. You can't ignore civic processes and then claim surprise when decisions are made without your input." She looked at Tom. "That said, Mr. Rutherford makes a valid point about material harm. The question is whether that harm is the result of HOA overreach or the result of Mr. Emerson's own negligence." She flipped through more pages, then sighed. "I'm going to continue the temporary restraining order on further construction while I review the full case law on this. No additional parking lot expansion until I make a final ruling. But Mr. Emmerson, the fence stays up and the parking lot that's already constructed remains in place. If you want that reversed, you'll need to prove that the HOA violated specific statutes or acted in bad faith, and I'm not seeing that evidence right now. They followed procedure. You didn't. That matters." "Your Honor," Tom started, "this hearing is continued for 30 days. I'll issue a written ruling at that time. Both parties should prepare for the possibility of a full trial if I don't find sufficient grounds to dismiss." She banged her gavel. "We're adjourned." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Tom tried to be encouraging, but we both knew the judge wasn't leaning our way. "She's not wrong about the procedure issue," Tom admitted. "You should have attended those meetings." "I didn't know it was serious." "That's not a legal defense." He sighed. "Look, we're not done yet. I'll research more case law, find precedents where HOAs were found to have overstepped even when following procedure. But Jacob, you need to be prepared for the possibility that we lose this." "And then what?" "Then the parking lot stays, you operate with a reduced herd, and you either learn to live with the HOA or you sell and move somewhere else." "This is my home." "I know, but sometimes the law doesn't care about what's fair. It only cares about what's legal." I drove back to the ranch, feeling defeated. The cattle were grazing on the back acres, crowded but managing. The fence gleamed in the afternoon sun, a reminder of everything I'd lost. That evening, Donna Pritchard showed up again, this time with a photographer. They took pictures of my barn, my fencing, my equipment shed. When I walked over to ask what they were doing, Donna smiled. "Just documenting code violations for our records. Your barn is still in violation of architectural standards. That's a $50 per day fine, starting next week if it's not repainted. Your equipment shed has a broken door. That's another violation. And I noticed several sections of your perimeter fencing are using barbed wire, which is prohibited within 200 feet of residential structures for safety reasons. That fencing has been there for decades. That doesn't make it compliant with current regulations." She handed me another notice. "You have 90 days to replace all barbed wire fencing within 200 feet of the nearest residential structure with approved alternative fencing. Failure to comply will result in daily fines and potential legal action." I looked at the notice. Replacing that much fencing would cost tens of thousands of dollars. "You're trying to bankrupt me." "We're trying to bring your property into compliance with community standards. If that's too difficult for you, perhaps you should consider selling to someone who's willing to maintain proper standards." There it is. That's what this is really about. "I don't know what you mean." "You want my land. You want me gone so you can expand your development." Donna's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Emmerson, if we wanted your land, we'd make you an offer. We're simply enforcing the rules that apply to everyone in the community. If you can't afford to maintain your property to acceptable standards, that's not our problem." She left, and I stood there holding another stack of violation notices, each one carrying fines that would add up to thousands of dollars per month. That night, I got a call from Bill Henderson. "Jacob, you still up?" "Yeah, what's going on?" "They're foreclosing on me." I sat up. "What?" "The HOA put a lien on my property for unpaid dues and fines. I didn't pay because I can't afford to pay. Now they're foreclosing. My lawyer says they can do it. I have 60 days before they auction my property to cover the debt." "How much do you owe them?" $8,000, dues, late fees, fines for the truck, fines for my fence needing repair, fines for having firewood stacked wrong. It just kept adding up. His voice cracked. I've lived here 32 years. Jacob, this was Mary's home. We raised our kids here. And now some HOA is taking it away over $8,000. Talk to Tom Rutherford. He can help. I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford any of this. He was quiet for a moment. I'm just calling to say goodbye. I'm putting the place up for sale tomorrow. Maybe I can get enough to pay off the lien and have something left over. Maybe not, but I'm done fighting. Bill, don't take care of yourself, Jacob. Don't let them do to you what they did to me. He hung up, and I sat in the dark, feeling the weight of everything crushing down. Bill was giving up. How many others were doing the same? How many long-time residents were being forced out by fines and fees and regulations designed to make rural life impossible in a residential zone? The next morning, I drove into town and started asking questions. I found 3 other property owners who'd been incorporated into the Whispering Pines HOA and were facing similar harassment. One was a woman named Martha Colson who kept chickens and was being fined for agricultural odors. Another was a man named Frank Torres, who had a woodworking shop in his garage and was being cited for commercial activities in a residential zone. The third was an elderly couple, George and Linda Preston, who were being fined for having an RV parked on their property more than 2 weeks per year. All of them were being crushed by fines and fees they couldn't afford. All of them were considering selling and leaving. We should fight this together, I said. We were sitting in a coffee shop in Kalispell, 5 people who'd been minding our own business until the HOA decided we were problems to be solved. If we pool resources, maybe we can afford a better legal challenge. I'm 76 years old, George Preston said. I don't have time for legal battles. I just want to live out my remaining years in peace. Then they win, I said. They take your home and they move on to the next person. Martha Colson shook her head. Even if we fight and win, the HOA will still be there. They'll still find ways to make our lives difficult. They have lawyers and resources and time. We have bills and jobs and lives to live. It's not a fair fight. She was right, but I couldn't accept it. So we just give up? We're being practical, Frank Torres said. I got a job offer in Billings. I was going to turn it down because I love my workshop. I love this property. But you know what? The HOA fines are going to cost me more than I'd make from moving. So I'm taking the job and selling the place. It's not giving up, it's being smart. One by one, they all said the same thing. They were tired of fighting. They were going to sell and move on. I was the only one still willing to stand and push back. Then I'll fight alone, I said. You'll lose, Martha said quietly. I'm sorry, Jacob, but you will. They have all the advantages. They have money, they have lawyers, they have the system on their side. What do you have? I have land that's been in my family for 70 years. I have a ranch my grandfather built with his own hands. That has to count for something. It counts for nostalgia, George said, but nostalgia doesn't win legal battles. I left the coffee shop feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. Even the people who should have been my allies were giving up. Maybe they were smarter than me. Maybe I was just being stubborn. But I couldn't let it go. Judge Morrison's written ruling came down 28 days after the hearing. Tom called me as soon as he got it. It's not good, Jacob. I closed my eyes. Tell me. She ruled that the HOA followed proper procedures and that the parking lot designation was within their legal authority. She dissolved the restraining order. They can finish construction. What about the material harm? What about forcing me to sell my cattle? She acknowledged the harm, but ruled that it was the result of your failure to participate in the democratic process, not the result of HOA overreach. She said, and I'm quoting here, "Property owners who choose not to engage with civic processes must accept the consequences of decisions made in their absence." So the fence stays up. The fence stays up, the parking lot gets finished, and you're still on the hook for all the HOA fines and fees. Tom paused. I'm sorry, Jacob. I really thought we had a shot at this. Can we appeal? To the Montana Supreme Court? Sure, that'll take another year and cost another $50,000, minimum. And honestly, I don't think we'd win. The The judge's ruling is legally sound, even if it's not fair. I thanked Tom and hung up. Then I walked outside and looked at my land. The fence, the gravel parking lot, my reduced herd grazing on insufficient pasture. Everything my family had built was being destroyed, one fee and fine and fence at a time. That evening, I got an email from the HOA. Construction would resume in 3 days. They expected the parking lot to be completed within 2 weeks. They also reminded me that I still owed 3 months of back dues, plus late fees, totaling $850, and the fines for my barn, my equipment shed, and my fencing were accumulating daily. I did the math. Between legal fees, lost cattle sales, and HOA fines, I was down over $70,000 and counting. My savings were gone. My retirement fund was gone. If this continued much longer, I'd lose the ranch entirely. The next morning, a white pickup truck with Whispering Pines HOA logos pulled up to the parking lot. 2 men got out and started surveying, marking out where the asphalt would go. I watched from my porch, drinking coffee, feeling helpless. Then, something inside me snapped. I walked to my barn and got my tractor. It was an old John Deere, reliable as sunrise, and I'd used it for everything from moving hay to clearing snow. I climbed on, started the engine, and drove it straight toward the fence. The surveyor nearest to me looked up, confused at first, then alarmed as he realized what I was about to do. "Hey! Hey, stop!" I didn't stop. I drove that tractor right into the fence, the blade on the front catching the chain link and ripping it from the posts. Metal screamed, posts snapped, and the fence came down in a twisted mess of wire and rage. The surveyor was on his phone, yelling into it. I backed up the tractor and hit the fence again, tearing down another section. Then another. The second surveyor ran for his truck and drove off fast, spraying gravel. I kept going until the entire fence was down, 800 feet of chain link reduced to scrap metal. Then I backed the tractor up and started ripping up the gravel parking lot, the blades scraping it away, exposing the grass beneath. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, I'd torn up half the parking lot. Deputy Mills stepped out of his cruiser, hand on his gun, looking bewildered and sad. "Jacob, what are you doing?" "Reclaiming my land." "You need to shut off the tractor and step down." "They had no right to take it." "Jacob, the court ruled in their favor. This is destruction of property. I don't want to arrest you, but I will if you don't stop right now." I looked at him, this kid I'd known since he was in high school, and saw that he meant it. I shut off the tractor and climbed down. He put handcuffs on me, gentle as he could, apologizing the whole time. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I really am. But I've got to take you in." They put me in the back of the cruiser, and as we drove away, I looked back at my ranch. The fence was down, the parking lot was torn up, and my cattle were wandering toward the water trough they hadn't been able to reach for weeks. It wasn't much of a victory, but it was something. At the county jail, they processed me for criminal mischief and destruction of property. The bail was set at $10,000. I called Tom, and he came down within an hour, looking exhausted. "Jacob, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking I'm tired of being pushed around." "You just handed them everything they need to destroy you. They can sue for damages, press criminal charges, and you've violated the court order by destroying the fence and parking lot. Judge Morrison is going to be furious." "I don't care anymore." "Well, you should care, because you're looking at jail time and financial ruin." He sat down across from me in the holding cell. "I can probably get you out on bail tonight, but then what? You've got a criminal trial ahead of you now, on top of everything else. What does it matter? They were going to take the ranch anyway." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "There might be one other option." "What?" "Donna Pritchard called me an hour ago. She said the HOA is willing to drop all charges and forgive all fines if you agree to sell your property to them at fair market value." I laughed, bitter and tired. There it is. That's what this was about from the beginning. They want my land. Probably. But at this point, it might be your best option. Take the money, start over somewhere else, somewhere without an HOA. That land is my family's legacy. Jacob, your family's legacy is about to get buried under criminal charges and civil judgments. If you take the deal, you walk away with something. If you fight this, you'll lose everything and probably end up in jail. I sat there in that cell, smelling the disinfectant and sweat, listening to the fluorescent lights hum overhead. Everything I'd fought for, everything I'd tried to protect, was gone. The ranch was gone, even if I was still technically standing on it. What's fair market value? They're offering $400,000. The land's worth at least $600,000. The land was worth $600,000 before you destroyed $8,000 worth of HOA property and got yourself arrested. Now it's worth whatever they're willing to pay because no one else is going to buy it with this mess hanging over it. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall. So they win. They were always going to win, Jacob. I tried to tell you that from the start. Tom posted my bail that night, and I went home to a ranch that didn't feel like mine anymore. The fence was still down, the parking lot still torn up, but it was temporary. The HOA would repair it, finish it, turn it into exactly what they'd planned. I spent 3 days thinking about the offer, $400,000. It was enough to buy a smaller place somewhere else, somewhere far from any HOA. It was enough to start over, build a new herd, try again. But it wasn't home. On the 4th day, I was sitting on my porch when an unfamiliar car pulled up. Out stepped a woman in her 30s, wearing jeans and a blazer, carrying a briefcase. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the confident walk of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Mr. Emmerson, my name is Diana Jameson. I'm an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. I already have a lawyer. I know, Tom Rutherford called me. He thought you might benefit from a second opinion. She sat down on the porch steps without waiting for an invitation. I've reviewed your case, and I think you're getting screwed. Tell me something I don't know. Here's what you don't know. The way the Whispering Pines HOA incorporated your property into their jurisdiction was legally questionable. The county rezoning was done through an emergency measure that bypassed normal public comment periods. Technically legal, but it used a provision meant for genuine emergencies like natural disasters, not for expanding HOA boundaries. I sat up straighter. Tom didn't mention that. Tom's a good general practice lawyer, but HOA law is a specialty. I've spent the last 5 years fighting HOAs across Montana, and I've seen this trick before. They push through a rezoning using emergency provisions, incorporate properties they want, then dare people to fight it in court. Most people can't afford to fight, so they get away with it. So what can we do? We challenge the rezoning itself. If we can prove the emergency provision was misused, the entire incorporation becomes invalid. That means no HOA authority over your property, no parking lot, no fines, nothing. Tom said that would cost $50,000 and take a year. Tom was talking about appealing the parking lot ruling. I'm talking about challenging the underlying authority. It's a different legal strategy. She pulled papers from her briefcase. It'll still cost money and take time, but I work on contingency for cases like this. You don't pay unless we win. And if we win? If we win, the HOA has to remove the parking lot, pay for restoration of your land, and compensate you for all damages, including the cattle you had to sell. Plus, we can go after them for legal fees and punitive damages for harassment. It sounded too good to be true. What's the catch? The catch is that if we lose, you're still facing criminal charges for destroying the fence and parking lot. The HOA offer to drop charges if you sell goes away once we file new litigation. You'd be all in, no safety net. So I risk everything on a legal theory. You risk everything on a strong legal case with good precedent. I've won 3 similar cases in the past 2 years. I know how these HOAs operate, and I know how to beat them. She looked at me intently. But you need to understand what you're signing up for. This is going to get ugly. They're going to come at you with everything they have. More fines, more harassment, probably more criminal charges if they can manufacture them. You need to be strong enough to take it. I thought about my grandfather, building this ranch from nothing. I thought about my father, working this land until his hands were gnarled and his back was bent. I thought about 35 head of cattle sold at auction because an HOA wanted parking spaces. Let's do it, Diana smiled. Good. First thing we do is file an emergency motion to halt all HOA enforcement actions against you pending the outcome of the rezoning challenge. That stops the fines, stops the harassment, gives us room to work. Will the judge grant it? Judge Morrison? Probably not, but we're not going to Judge Morrison. We're going to federal court. Federal court? Your civil rights were violated when the county used emergency provisions to incorporate your property without proper due process. That makes it a federal case. We'll file in the district court for Montana. Different judge, different jurisdiction, different rules. Within a week, Diana had filed a comprehensive lawsuit challenging the rezoning, the HOA incorporation, and every action they'd taken against my property. She also filed for an immediate injunction stopping all HOA enforcement pending trial. Donna Pritchard showed up at my ranch 2 days after the filing, and she was furious. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Emmerson." I'm fighting back. There's a difference. You destroyed HOA property, you're facing criminal charges, and now you want to drag this out in federal court? You're only going to make things worse for yourself. Maybe, but at least I'm making things difficult for you too. Her face flushed red. Our offer to buy your property is withdrawn. We're going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law, and we're going to make sure you lose everything. Then I guess we'll see each other in court? She left, tires spinning in my driveway, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The federal court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Diana got a temporary injunction stopping new HOA fines, though existing ones remained in place. The criminal charges for destroying the fence were still active, but the county prosecutor agreed to delay any action until after the federal case resolved. During those 6 weeks, Diana worked like a machine. She deposed county officials, got records of the emergency rezoning meeting, interviewed other property owners who'd been incorporated into the HOA. She found that the emergency provision had been invoked based on a claim of urgent need for residential parking due to fire safety concerns, but there was no documentation of any actual fire safety issues. It's a sham, Diana said, showing me the records. They manufactured an emergency to bypass the normal process. The county commissioners who voted for it all have financial ties to the Whispering Pines development. 2 of them own properties there. It's a textbook case of conflict of interest and procedural abuse. Can we prove that in court? We can show a pattern of irregularities that should be enough to invalidate the rezoning. Whether the judge agrees depends on how strictly they interpret the emergency provision statute. The hearing was held in the federal courthouse in Missoula. Diana and I sat at the plaintiff's table while the HOA had a team of 3 lawyers led by Richard Blackwell. The county was represented by their attorney, a nervous young woman named Sarah Chen who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The judge was the Honorable Marcus Reynolds, a 60-year-old appointee with a reputation for being thorough and fair. He'd read all the briefs before the hearing and came out looking skeptical of everyone involved. Diana presented our case methodically. She showed the timeline of the rezoning, the lack of proper public notice, the misuse of the emergency provision, the conflicts of interest among county commissioners. She brought in an expert witness, a city planning professor from the University of Montana, who testified that the rezoning didn't meet the standards for emergency action. Emergency provisions exist for situations requiring immediate action to protect public health and safety, the professor said. Claims of long-term parking inadequacy don't qualify as emergencies. If Whispering Pines has been dealing with parking problems for months or years, that's by definition not an emergency requiring bypass of normal procedures. Richard Blackwell fought back hard. He argued that the county had broad discretion to determine what constituted an emergency, and that courts shouldn't second-guess local government decisions. He brought in the fire marshal, who testified that insufficient parking could theoretically create emergency vehicle access problems. Theoretically is doing a lot of work in that sentence, Diana said on cross-examination. Were there any actual documented incidents of emergency vehicles being blocked due to parking at Whispering Pines? The fire marshal shifted in his seat. Not specifically, no. Any complaints from emergency responders about access problems? Not that I'm aware of. Any studies or reports commissioned to assess the parking situation before the rezoning? I don't believe so. So the entire emergency justification was based on theoretical problems that might possibly occur at some point in the future, rather than any actual documented emergency? The county commissioners felt it was prudent to act preemptively. But there was no actual emergency. I can't say there was an emergency, no. Judge Reynolds took notes through all of it, his expression giving nothing away. When both sides finished, he recessed to review the evidence and case law. We waited 3 hours. Diana seemed confident, but I was a wreck. Everything depended on this ruling. If we lost, I'd be right back where I started, only worse because now I'd burned the bridge with the HOA's offer to buy. Finally, the judge returned. We all stood as he entered, then sat when he gestured. "I've reviewed the evidence and the applicable law," Judge Reynolds said. "The question before this court is whether the county's use of emergency provisions to expedite the rezoning was proper under Montana law and consistent with the due process protections of the United States Constitution." He looked at the county attorney. "Ms. Chen, the county's position is that it has broad discretion to determine what constitutes an emergency requiring expedited action. That position is legally correct. However, that discretion is not unlimited. Courts can and should review whether the invocation of emergency powers was reasonable under the circumstances." He shuffled papers. "In this case, the evidence shows that Whispering Pines had been dealing with parking capacity issues for at least 2 years prior to the rezoning. Multiple solutions were proposed and rejected during that time. The HOA had purchased options on adjacent land but had not pursued development. This does not present a picture of an emergency requiring immediate action without normal public process." I felt my heart start to beat faster. Phew. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the evidence suggests that county commissioners who voted for the emergency rezoning had financial interests in the Whispering Pines development. While this doesn't prove corruption, it does raise serious questions about whether the decision was made in the public interest or to benefit private parties." He looked directly at me. "Mr. Emmerson had a property right to participate in the democratic process regarding changes to zoning that affected his land. That right was effectively denied when the county bypassed normal procedures. This constitutes a due process violation." Diana squeezed my arm, but I was afraid to hope yet. "Therefore," Judge Reynolds said, "I'm ruling that the emergency rezoning was improper and is hereby vacated. All actions taken under the authority of that rezoning, including the incorporation of Mr. Emmerson's property into the Whispering Pines HOA jurisdiction, are invalid." The HOA lawyers erupted in objections, but the judge held up his hand. "This ruling is limited to the procedural defects in the rezoning process. The county is free to pursue a new rezoning through proper channels with adequate public notice and comment periods. But until and unless that happens, Mr. Emmerson's property is not subject to HOA authority." He banged his gavel. "This court orders the Whispering Pines HOA to remove all structures from Mr. Emmerson's property within 30 days and to restore the land to its previous condition at their expense. Mr. Emmerson is entitled to pursue claims for damages resulting from the invalid incorporation. We'll schedule a hearing on damages for next month." I sat there stunned as the judge left. Diana was grinning, shaking my hand, talking about next steps and damage calculations. The HOA lawyers were gathering their papers, looking furious. Sarah Chen from the county attorney's office looked relieved. We won. The next month was chaos. The HOA tried to appeal the ruling, but the district court denied their request for a stay. They were required to remove the parking lot immediately. I watched with deep satisfaction as crews came in, tore up the asphalt they'd just laid, pulled out the gravel, and started restoring the grass. The fence came down again, this time permanently. My cattle returned to the full 40 acres, and I could finally breathe again. The damages hearing was straightforward. Diana presented documentation of everything: the cost of legal fees, the value of the cattle I'd been forced to sell, the HOA fines I'd paid, even compensation for stress and lost business opportunities. The judge awarded me $230,000 plus all legal fees. But the real victory came a week later when the Montana Attorney General's office announced an investigation into the county commissioners who'd voted for the emergency rezoning. The conflicts of interest that Judge Reynolds had noted caught the attention of state officials, and they wanted answers. 2 of the commissioners resigned within a month. The third, a man named Robert Gallagher, who'd been on the board for 15 years and owned 3 properties in Whispering Pines, was indicted for misconduct in public office. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Donna Pritchard resigned as HOA president 2 weeks after the federal court ruling. I heard through the grapevine that the HOA board blamed her for the legal disaster and the enormous financial hit they'd taken. Without her driving the aggressive expansion, the HOA settled back into normal operations, leaving the remaining rural properties alone. Bill Henderson called me in September, 8 months after the whole thing started. "Jacob, you hear the news." "What news?" "The county just announced they're creating a new zoning category for rural agricultural properties that gives HOA exemptions. They're calling it the Emmerson protection, informally. You changed the law, man." I hadn't set out to change anything except my own situation, but I was glad something good came out of it. Maybe the next rancher wouldn't have to go through what I did. I used the settlement money to buy back 15 head of the cattle I'd sold, plus invest in some breeding stock to build the herd back up. It would take a few years to get back to 90 head, but I had time. The land was mine again, truly mine, without anyone looking over my shoulder with violation notices and fines. On a cold morning in late October, I stood on my porch with coffee and watched the sun rise over the Flathead Valley. My cattle were grazing peacefully, spread out across 40 acres of land that had been in my family for 3 generations. The grass had grown back where the parking lot used to be, and you'd barely know it had ever been there. My phone rang. It was Diana Jameson. "Jacob, I wanted to let you know the HOA just settled the remaining claims. They're paying for all restoration costs and agreeing not to pursue any further action against you. The criminal charges for the fence have been dropped. You're completely clear." That's good news. There's more. 3 other property owners who were in similar situations have hired me to challenge their HOA incorporations. Your case set the precedent. We're going to clean up this mess across the county. Glad I could help? You did more than help. You stood up when everyone else was giving up. That matters." She paused. "Take care of yourself, Jacob. Enjoy your ranch." I hung up and looked out at the land again. It had cost me a year of my life, most of my savings, and more stress than any person should endure. But it was worth it. The sun climbed higher, painting the mountains gold and red with autumn colors. My cattle were fat and healthy, ready for winter. The barn still needed paint, but that was my choice now, not some HOA committees. The fence was barbed wire and weathered wood, exactly like my grandfather had built it. This was home. Not because someone told me it could be, not because I followed their rules and paid their fees, but because 3 generations of my family had worked this land, built this life, and refused to let anyone take it away. I finished my coffee and headed to the barn. There was work to do, hay to move, cattle to check, a ranch to run. But for the first time in a year, I did it without looking over my shoulder, without waiting for the next violation notice, without wondering how much longer I could hold on. The fight was over, and I'd won. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd come after. Everyone who wanted to live their life on their own terms without some HOA board deciding what color their barn should be. As I walked across the field, frost crunching under my boots, I thought about what Judge Reynolds had said in his ruling. Property rights aren't just about owning land. They're about having a voice in decisions that affect your life and your home. When that voice is taken away through procedural tricks and manufactured emergencies, the courts exist to restore it. My voice had been restored. My land had been restored. My life had been restored. And that morning, walking across 40 acres of Montana grassland, with mountains on the horizon and cattle grazing peacefully, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The nightmare of the HOA was over, but the lessons remained. I became more involved in county government, attending meetings, speaking up on issues that affected rural landowners. I helped organize a group of ranchers and farmers to make sure our interests were represented when zoning decisions were made. Bill Henderson didn't lose his property after all. With the precedent from my case, he was able to challenge his HOA incorporation too, and Diana represented him pro bono. He got to keep his father's truck in his barn, got his fines reversed, and went back to living his life in peace. Martha Colson kept her chickens, Frank Torres kept his workshop, George and Linda Preston kept their RV, One by one, the people who'd been forced into the Whispering Pines HOA against their will were freed from it. The Whispering Pines development still exists, and it still has an HOA for the people who actually live there and want to be part of it. But they learned that they can't just expand their authority over people who never agreed to join. Property rights matter, due process matters, democracy matters. As for Donna Pritchard, I heard she moved to California. I never saw her again after that day in federal court, watching her lawyers argue desperately to maintain control over land that was never theirs to control. I don't know if she learned anything from the experience, or if she's out there somewhere trying the same tricks on some other unsuspecting property owner. I hope not. I hope she learned that you can't just steamroll people because you have a gavel and a covenant and a majority vote. You can't take someone's livelihood, their heritage, their home, and expect them to just accept it quietly. Some of us will fight back. And sometimes, if we're lucky and we have good lawyers and the law is on our side, we'll win. It's been 2 years now since that morning when I woke up to find a fence through my grazing field. 2 years since I thought I was going to lose everything my family had built. The ranch is thriving. The herd is back to 80 head and growing, and I sleep soundly, knowing that no HOA board is plotting their next violation notice. I still get mail from the county, but now it's just normal stuff. Tax bills, election information, community announcements. No more certified letters, no more violation notices, no more demands for payment of dues I never agreed to owe. Life is good. The land is mine. The cattle are healthy. And every morning when I walk outside with my coffee and look out over those 40 acres, I remember what it took to keep them, and I'm grateful. Because home isn't just a place, it's a right, hard fought and hard won, and nobody gets to take that away.